Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on Tuesday, March 26th, with the noted critic Benjamin Taylor in conversation with Molly Haskell. Taylor will be discussing his new book on Willa Cather. This hybrid event will take place in the Skylight Room on the 9th floor. But tonight I am delighted to introduce Will Hermes to discuss his extraordinary new biography, Lou Reed, the King of New York. Hermes will be in conversation with Amanda Petrusich. Will is a longtime contributing editor to Rolling Stone and to National Public Radio's All Things Considered. His work has also appeared in Pitchfork, Spin, the New York Times, The Village Voice, and many other publications. He is the author of Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, 5 Years in New York, that changed music forever. That came out in 2011, a history of the New York City music scene in the 1970s. Will is also an alumnus of Queens College, part of CUNY, so we celebrate him for being that. Amanda Petrusich is an American music journalist. She is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of 3 books, Pink Moon, that came out in 2007, It Still Moves, Lost Songs, Lost Highways, and the Search for the Next American Music, and Do Not Tell Any Price, the wild, obsessive hunt for the world's rarest 78 RPM records. Among other awards, she won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2016. Please look for all these books at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Will and Amanda will be in conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will take questions from our live audience. We will try to end this program after 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our events. Amanda, you now have the stage. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. A warm hello and thank you to everyone joining us on the live stream as well. Of course, to the CUNY Graduate Center, Shelby White, the Leon Levy Foundation. We're just thrilled to be here. Will, I'm so excited to get the chance to talk to you about this book. Will and I got a drink before coming here, and I had to really bite my tongue to sort of stop from there's sort of endless ways to engage in what you've done and to talk about Lou and to talk about the biography and to talk about your writing. So we'll do a little bit of that tonight. I'm just so thrilled you're here. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for coming. But can I just, before you get into it, can I just point out, it might be hard for people to see because of the distance, that Amanda did dress for the evening with a...
Can you see my little Warhol banana? And Will as well. We didn't plan this. We're just living this life.
Yeah, we didn't coordinate this. This is just like minds.
So I wanted to start. It's on a quite different scale, I think a much different scale than biography, of course. But whenever I'm in the midst of profiling someone for The New Yorker, there's always a moment where I sort of fall in love with my subject. And then, of course, there's also a moment where I briefly despise them. The act of writing itself, it's devotion, it's attention, it's respect. That can look a lot like love. And I'm curious how your relationship to Lou Reed evolved over the decade you spent working on this project.
It's complicated. The motivation for the book was really love, was loving this man's music, loving the Velvet Underground, discovering them in college, really. I discovered his solo work I think I might have written as a teenage dirtbag in Queens growing up, listening to the radio and hearing Rock and Roll Animal on WNEW-FM and WPLJ. But I fell in love with the music. I wrote my first book, Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, which was about New York during a 5-year period in the 70s. And Lou Reed had, Lou Reed was kind of he appears a couple of times, but he was kind of like an absent father in a way. Like him and Miles Davis were kind of like, the looming dads to so many young artists coming up at that point. They had laid groundwork. The answer to your question is just, I spent nearly 10 years, with some hiccups along the way, writing this book. And you spend that much time with a person, and you spend that much time with the people who were his contemporaries, members of his family, side musicians, people he went to school with, and you really feel like you're part of, you're part of a family, and families are complicated. And Reed was a complicated guy, so I came into this knowing that, a lot of people are passionate fans. Some people don't like his music. Some people love the Velvet Underground, didn't like his solo work. Some people are more into his solo work. People had very strong feelings about him both ways. So I think, as you said about profile subjects, like, yeah, you're in love, you get pissed off, and you fall back in love again. And I will say that, and this was kind of shocking to me, that the music never got old. The music I never got bored. And still, I hear Velvet Underground songs. They just seem to be everywhere, all the time, like cafes, movies. I went to see the new Wim Wenders film, which is magnificent, I should say. It's called Perfect Days. And yes, it is named for the Lou Reed song, Perfect Day, which figures prominently in the film, as does Velvet Underground music and some other stuff. So, yeah, it was a roller coaster.
I'm glad you bring up the kind of long, complicated legacy of the Velvet Underground, which really sort of began after the band dissolved, right? I mean, in a sense, it's all kind of after the fact and seems to still be evolving and growing and changing. Also within the decade you wrote this book, I think the cultural relationship to the kind of problematic Lou could be and the kind of unlikable Lou could be also changed, right? I think 10 years ago we maybe had a slightly higher tolerance for certain narratives about tortured genius or sort of certain narratives about toughness or even kind of what it means to be a New Yorker. All of that, I think, was shifting kind of while you were writing. And he is, complicated is really the best word to use to describe Lou, and the question of his likability. I'm such a massive fan of your criticism. And I think criticism is a very different practice than biography, but you're so beautifully measured and kind of largely non-judgmental here about Reed the man, about sort of who he was. Was he a good person? Was he something else, something sort of adjacent to a good person? I'm curious, how hard was it for you to kind of temporarily shut down the part of your brain that is used to making qualitative judgments about art for something with a slightly lighter touch?
Well, you're writing about a person. You learn their history. You talk to people. You learn their struggles. And I'd never written a biography before, and I never even I never thought I would. I never necessarily aspired to write a biography on a single person because I have some ADHD, and I just think that it seemed to me that focusing on one person would just be, I need a broader canvas. So my first book was really writing about an artistic community in New York, or really communities. And even as a journalist, I like writing about communities of artistic pursuit. But Lou seemed to be a figure that was almost a zelig through post-war New York arts. He went to Syracuse University. He studied with Delmore Schwartz, one of the great New York poets, kind of proto-New York scene writer, who actually has an anthology. I think it might be his complete works are going to be published next month, so which is good timing. And then he came down to the city and somehow instantly connects with Andy Warhol and is thrown into the New York visual arts scene of the '60s and the experimental film scene of the '60s, and of course the music scene. And he contained multitudes as a person, I think, and I realized that this would be a book where I could write about him in context of this world, of all these characters, of the city, really, in the same way that I worked on the first book. But to go back to your question, it just seemed that the way through a person's life was to just get the facts, talk to everybody you could, and believe me, everybody had an opinion. Family members had very strong feelings about him, love, hate. Some of them were mixed together. He had a reputation for very often being a nasty guy. I heard that from so many people. Mostly people who didn't really know him that well, and he definitely had a hair-trigger temper, which I learned about, maybe where that came from, and we can get into that a little later. But I think you spend, enough time studying any person's life, you spend enough years on the planet, and you have empathy for people's bad behavior, hopefully. I think we're living in a time where empathy is in short supply, and thinking the best of someone, or thinking that maybe their hair trigger, anger response might be about something else other than the fact that you bumped into them in the grocery store aisle. So it was an exercise. The whole writing of it was really an exercise in kind of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, but just really trying to nail down the facts as best you could. And sometimes that was tricky.
Well, you had early access to Reed's archive, which is held at the New York Public Library, the Performing Arts Public Library at Lincoln Center. It's a real archive. It's not a vanity project. It's not necessarily sort of prearranged to cast Reed in a particular light. In the book, you quote Reed's wife, the artist Laurie Anderson, saying, "It gives people courage to see, wow, Lou Reed made that thing? That was horrible." Which I loved. I'm curious if there's anything you found in the archive that perhaps underscored the idea that genius is fallible.
Genius is fallible.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I should I'll take a detour and then get back to that question, just because you mentioned Laurie Anderson, who I have to say is she's one of the reasons why I wanted to take on this project. In addition to loving Reed's music, it was also writing about her in my first book, meeting her, speaking to her for a profile I did for the New York Times, and really just admiring her so much as an artist and being so amazed that her and Lou connected, because it was towards the end of his life. They spent 20 years together, but that was, he'd been through a lot of iterations of Lou Reed's by that point in the early 90s when they connected. So it was, loving his music. It was, wanting to write about the latter part of his life, which I felt like hadn't really been done that well, just really hadn't been done fully. And I wanted to write about his influence on the culture, which I also felt hadn't been the approach that some of the other biographers who wrote about him before me, many of whom did a great job, and certainly I could say almost all of which I read and, drew from. I mean, I think we all as writers stand on the shoulders of the people who've written about our subjects before, and there aren't many new subjects out there. But to circle back to the original question, going through the archives, I was so grateful that Laurie made the archives public. I thought that was just a brilliant move. And I had no idea that was ever going to happen when I started the book. I guess I knew there were archives at a certain point, but I think I was already into the book, and there was nothing to guarantee that those were ever going to be made available. But they were, and I spent the bulk of the summer, or a good section of the summer of 2019, couch surfing at my friend Matthew and Susan's apartment on the Upper West Side. Thank you, Matthew and Susan. I appreciate that. They're thanked in the book, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened, frankly. Price of hotels in New York, Jesus. But going through those archives, and they are serious, 200 plus boxes, for any biographer, my God, like not everybody has archives like that, and they had been cataloged by the time I got into them by the Herculean efforts of the people who run the Special Collections Room up at the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library, the New York Public Libraries. Any of you can get it. If you have a New York City library card, you can go up there and jump in. The fallibility of genius is how genius is forged, right? Like, I mean, I bet you've, discovered that with everybody you profile. You're a pretty genius writer yourself, and I think you know what goes into what you do, and that not every
a lot of bad drafts.
Yeah. Not every draft comes out good. So yeah, you certainly saw that. Like, some of Lou's records were not good. Like, really, just not good. But the thing that amazed me was like going back, and I had to like reacquaint myself with some of his later solo work. Almost virtually every album had at least one or two examples of why this guy was just an absolute stone cold master of what he did. And that was, that was really encouraging. At the same time, I think that genius is also the product of community. And one of the things I tried to do with this book was write about all the people he worked with, surrounded himself with, made art with, made love with. We are the product of all the people that that raise us up. So I wanted to kind of share the spotlight with a lot of other folks.
You write in the beginning of the book about the strange work of having to sort out the mythology, the apocrypha, the bullshit from the real story of Reed's life. One of the first sentences in the book is, "A lot has been written about Lewis Allen Reed, plenty of it dubious." And some of that, I think, was Reed himself, right? I mean, there was an aggressive kind of persona creation. He himself was not always very helpful in that regard. So, two-part question. First, what are your favorite untrue stories about Reed? And in the end, do you think the distance between the sort of persona, the creation of Lou Reed, and the man himself got smaller?
Wow, that second question is
Hey, I snuck that one in there.
That's a good one, and a little bit of a head scratcher. But the first question, remind me of the first question.
Were there stories about him that had been circulated and you thought, or you were able to figure out, like, okay, that was totally untrue. That was a rumor Lou started about himself, or that was a rumor, Danny Fields, whoever it was, started about Lou. Warhol, who knows? There was a lot of persona creation going on in that scene.
Yes. I like the fact that he gave his name once as Louis Fairbanks, and you can still find it on the internet, that like his real name was Louis Fairbanks, which it was not. It was Louis Reed, and family name Rabinowitz, and I chart how that was changed. But it was interesting to me. His sister also changed her name. I think she was born Margaret, changed her name to Merrill after growing up with the nickname Bunny. And it was interesting to me that Reed in later years would often talk about how he could play this guy, Lou Reed, really well. And another quote I'm paraphrasing here is, sometimes I'm 80% him, sometimes I'm 20% him, but I'm never 100% him. So, I don't know. Did he like the Lou Reed character is a badass. Like he was a mean, nasty, drug-taken, wild man in a lot of ways. And he certainly was that at times, and he could be very, very nasty. And he was struggling with anxiety, I think, a lot. I really tried to not be an armchair psychologist in this, but I think from talking to family members, he was dealing with anxiety, and I had a moment going through the archives that I think it was an aha moment for me about just celebrities in general, because I'm not sure how many archives of famous people have files and files of fan mail, like packed. And I must have spent at least 2 or 3 days just going through fan mail. And a lot of them were just like, I love this song, and this is great. But Lou Reed fans tend to be really passionate, really intense, very literate. And some of them were a little scary. Some of them were like kind of stalkery. And like...
It's very lovely and very human that he kept those. I would have thought he set them on fire.
It's true. I mean, but again, I don't know. Like, did he keep them? Did his management company keep them? I think he probably wanted them kept, and maybe the stalkerish ones for legal reasons they just wanted to hold on to in case, like, they had to follow up any leads. But those aside, like that, those letters made me think that like anybody in the public spotlight would have reason to be kind of afraid, especially somebody like Reed who would walk around the city, didn't have bodyguards. It's just like somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I could see like being like, fuck off, Is that okay? Do we need to bleep that? I'm sorry. But I could see like having a hair trigger response. But one other thing I'll just say, which I can see why he would want to keep some of these letters, because they were just multiple pages about people's whose lives who testify about how his art really affected their lives, changed their lives, helped them mourn, like the album Magic and Loss. Like there were so many. That was an album about. Please give Magic and Loss a round of applause. Like that was an album about friends of his dying, and he got so many letters from people who said that really helped me through. Doc Pomus, I think, was the most clear subject of that album, but there were multiple people who that album was about. So that was super nice. And also people who were, coming to terms with issues of sexuality and gender identification. And that was moving to read as well. Just really, if you're an artist and you're making work that touches people so deeply on all these different levels, like you got to say like, yeah, there's, I'm on the right track here.
Yeah, certainly. I want to talk more about all of that in a moment. But you quote one of Reed's creative writing professors at Syracuse, the poet Delmore Schwartz, you mentioned earlier, calling rock and roll catgut music, which as a lover of both cats and rock and roll, I was offended by this. But I was hoping I could get you to talk a little bit about Schwartz's influence on Reed.
Yeah, that was big. Like, Reed loved music, but he also really wanted to be a writer. He really identified as a poet. One of the greatest early finds going through archives was actually going through the Syracuse University archives. And they have these zines, the Lonely Woman Quarterly. I think there are maybe 3 issues. Mimeographed zines. Can people of a certain age smell the mimeograph fluid smell when I say that word? It's basically pre-Xerox copy format, and he'd do these zines with other writers, and there was poetry, there were illustrations. He was writing fiction. He was writing social commentary. He was writing poems. That was super interesting. And Delmore was his creative writing teacher.
Reed famously loathed journalists, but sort of took, I think, at various points in his life, it seemed as though he sort of wanted to be a music critic.
he wrote a very well-known Kanye West review towards the end of his life.
Yeah, he reviewed Yeezus for The Guardian I think it was in 2010. And there are lines in that piece that I think are objectively bizarre, but then he'll write something like, if you like sound, listen to what he's giving you, about Kanye West. And I think
about that.
That's it. No, well, I did. I caught my breath a little bit. But I think you might be the first biographer who dug up those copies of the Lonely Women Quarterly. Is that right?
I am not sure, but I probably spent more time writing about them than anybody else did, if I wasn't the absolute first. But it was just fascinating to me because I'm a writer. So like seeing his writing in various forms over the years. I mean, he did a tour diary for the New Yorker at one point. He was so delighted when he finally published his first book of lyrics. And before that, he was actually ready. And he says this in a famous letter, which we were talking about before, to Delmore Schwartz. He thought that Delmore Schwartz was like, he wrote this in an introduction to a Delmore Schwartz collection. Delmore was the first great man I ever met. And he never stopped invoking his name as a great short story writer, a great poet, and a guy who really, really influenced him in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe good and bad. Delmore was in a rough patch when he was near the end of his life in Syracuse, and he had been he was drinking a lot, he was taking drugs, he had committed himself to an institution, and so was like not teaching for one semester that Lou was there, and they kind of became drinking buddies. Lou would kind of like chaperone him to faculty parties just to kind of like make sure he'd get home in one piece. But the famous quote from Reed about Delmore Schwartz, and just to put a cap on answering the first part of your question, was Delmore said, "Lou, don't ever sell out, because if you do, I'll haunt you." And I always thought like, oh, that's great, and he said that so many times, and he wrote it in a number of essays, maybe liner notes. And then there was this live radio recording of him doing a Vince Scelsa song circle at the bottom line some years ago, where Vince Scelsa asked him about that line, and he kind of implied that he made it up. So yeah, in terms of like verifying facts about Lou Reed's life, that's another thing where it was kind of like in reverse, thinking that something was true for so long and like, maybe it's not.
That's a great one. So you've said that Reed's relationship to queerness and kind of how queer culture shaped both his selfhood and his output was one of many things that attracted him to you as a subject. And in the book, to kind of return to the idea of Lou hating journalists, you write about Lester Bangs's very famous piece, Let Us Now Praise Famous Death Dwarves, or How I Slugged It Out with Lou Reed and Stayed Awake, a kind of completely insane piece of reporting from 1975. And in that piece, Bangs is cruel about Rachel Humphreys, a trans woman who was a muse and a companion to Reed. And you suggest that perhaps Reed's hatred of that piece and the way Bangs treated Rachel Humphreys in that piece may be sort of the origin point of his kind of lifelong combative, aggressive, antagonistic relationship with the press.
Yeah, I think that was certainly part of it. And he had, there were other things too, because I think journalists can be really lazy. And maybe music journalists have a bad reputation for being lazy. I know you're not lazy.
I interviewed Lou.
I think I'm lazy. And that's going to be my question. That's my next question. As soon as I answer this one, and I'll keep it short so we can get back to that. But yeah, Bangs. We could talk about Rachel, who I think was such an important figure, as one of the great women in his life. And they were together for 3 years. But this piece, like Lester Bangs, was really, really nasty. Just said such nasty things about her, just disparaging. And I don't know why he did it, because Lester Bangs showed himself to be a very smart and sensitive person in a lot of other avenues. But at this point, he said things that Reed just found unforgivable, never spoke to him again. And this was a critic that they had like kind of a good relationship. Like even after that, I remember like talking to or reading an interview with the great guitarist Robert Quine, who was very close friends with Lester Bangs, and he relayed a question from Lou to Lester, wanting to know what Lester thought of his new album. because he really valued, Lester was a critic who didn't pull punches, so his opinion meant something to him. But speaking of journalists and Lou Reed, why don't you tell us? Amanda did an interview with Lou Reed, which is included in a great book of primary source material that I drew on called Last Interviews, with Lou Reed. I think it's a series of books. But you did it for Pitchfork, right?
Yes, Pitchfork in 2007. I'm not letting you turn this interview around, by the way, Will. Nice try. We were talking earlier about how funny it is when two journalists are in conversation because it's like who's
Give me one. I mean, come on.
Yes, I interviewed Lou in 2007 for Pitchfork. We were talking about a reissue of Metal Machine Music, which had just been staged in Germany. There'd been a whole kind of elaborate theatrical presentation of it. And we were also talking about the Hudson River Wind Meditations, which were a sort of series of compositions that had been written and recorded kind of to sort of aid or enhance his Tai Chi practice, which he was famously very interested in toward the end of his life. He was nice to me. I got lucky.
Was it in person?
No, it was on the phone. I've never been more terrified for an interview before or since. And he
proper way to approach an interview with Lou Reed.
He was quite nice, to the point where I almost had that moment. He was being so nice that I was like, is he making fun of me? Like it was like I couldn't believe it. It's even reading it back now, I'm like, what was going on here? He kept giving me compliments. He asked me if I was married. I don't know. I don't know which Lou I got. I got a Lou.
Well, you were also talking about music that was. You weren't asking him about Walk on the Wild Side.
No. And I am a Metal Machine Music fan. So thank you, the two of you. I like difficult people and I like difficult records. And that, for me, it was a sort of confluence of all my interests. But yes, I liked that record and I was very curious about it. And I think maybe that opened something up in him. I don't know. Or it was just the right moment on the right day. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of a fallacy that he hated all journalists, because there were some journalists that he really clicked with. Jonathan Cott is one who he did magnificent interviews with him. Michael Gilmore writes for Rolling Stone also. He had a magnificent interview with him. Both of those were really kind of key primary source texts for me. David Frick as well, who conducted that Velvet Underground kind of summit, at least a partial summit, at the New York Public Library a few years before Reed passed, that brought together. John didn't come, and Sterling had already passed, but Mo was there, and it was a lovely evening. So yeah. He recognized excellence.
Wow. Reed was a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe, which is an influence you kind of parse in the biography. And I have been recently rereading some Poe myself, and Poe has an essay called The Imp of the Perverse, which is sort of, it's a great title, it's a great phrase, and it sort of unpacks this notion that sometimes we're just so seized by this uncontrollable desire to say the worst thing we can possibly think of, and it just slowly overtakes your brain. It's the scariest story Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote. It just slowly overtakes your brain until suddenly you've said it, and you just want to cut your own tongue out of your mouth. Which brings me back to this sort of, this question of...
What would that have to do with Lou Reed?
Well, I think once again...
I don't see the connection.
I think Reed himself, certainly afflicted by the imp of the perverse, that question of his likability, people are complicated, nobody is one thing. But with Reed, I think it's particularly interesting because the music is so tender, and there's so much empathy often in the lyrics, and I think in the performance. I'm just curious, for him being such an irascible and sort of complicated subject, how did you reconcile those two things? The stunning beauty of the songs with this guy that could be cruel?
Well, I think he was incredibly sensitive, and he was a very tender person to people who were his his intimates and friends. I mean, I think one of the big surprises, sometimes people will ask, like, oh, what was the biggest surprise that you found researching the story? And it was talking to people who talked about how loving, how tender, how generous he was, and never saw the nasty side of him. Like, literally, I was just like, and these weren't necessarily people who I thought were like, you know, trying to put on a good face. Like, this was true. And they just said, well, you know, he just didn't suffer fools, or he was impatient. And, you know, that is, I think he, you know, he swung both ways. He really could feel both ends of the spectrum really, really profoundly. One of the people I interviewed a number of times, and sadly wanted to interview one last time but wasn't able to, was his good friend Hal Wilner, who is a brilliant musical mind, produced work of Lou's, and Hal would tell me, like, you know, Lou was so susceptible to beauty that when he was hearing something that he thought was really beautiful, he would pull up his sleeve. He'd pull up his sleeve and say, look, goosebumps, as an indication that something was really moving him. And in fact, I think Wilner was with him and some other folks right before he passed. And I think some of his last words were, I'm so susceptible to beauty right now.
Your writing about, I think, the final moments of his life was just, I mean, if I had sleeves, I would pull them up and say goosebumps. It's extraordinary. The whole sort of last coda of the book is extraordinary in that way. I had a bit of writing advice from a professor when I was in college who told me the easiest way to make a character likable is to give him a dog. And I loved Lou's relationship to his little terrier, Lola Bell.
Lola Bell. Rest in peace, Lola Bell.
You know, that to me, and you write about it, of course, in the book. I think Laurie Anderson, in fact, maybe made a film about Lola Bell after she, too, passed. But I feel like, I'm glad there's so many Lola Bell fans in the room. Lola Bell representing tonight. I think his love of that dog, their collective love of that, softened him so much in my eyes. Really, it's good advice. Give a character a dog.
He's a dog. I mean, he had multiple dogs in his life. He had the Baron in the 70s. He had Seymour in Syracuse, who became the family dog. Seymour was named after a character in stories by John Updike. J.D. Salinger, thank you. Salinger stories about Seymour Glass, thank you. But because Seymour was a female dog, it was spelled with an E at the end. His sister told me that, and I met Lola Bell, who was lovely. She was playing.
Did you interview her?
I didn't interview her, but I was interviewing Laurie, and I was at the apartment, and Lola Bell was doing music therapy, I think, and Lola Bell with a music therapist playing a keyboard that was on the floor, kind of like a twister board that, like, you would touch a key and it would make a tone, and Lola Bell was jamming.
Took after her parents. You mentioned toward the end of the book that everyone who lived in New York for a certain amount of time has a Lou Reed story. And you quote Amy Poehler saying, he was like a robin in spring. He was the guy who told you you lived in New York. I think a lot of people, myself included, have run into him at Film Forum, where he was constantly falling asleep during movies. I'm curious, since the book's publication, doing events like this, interacting with all the people who knew and loved him, have you heard many, many more of these stories? Like, you know, this one time I lit Lou Reed's cigarette on the Bowery, or whatever it might be. People must be telling you those things all the time.
Yes, they still come. I get emails. I literally this morning, I got a very long email from a guy in Sweden who just shared with me some very intense personal stuff involving his relationship to Lou Reed's music. And I don't know what it is. Like, I spent like nearly 10 years writing this book, and I still don't know that I can say exactly why he is so beloved, or that people, even people who don't like him, seem to love him, seem to be obsessed with him in the way that, like, maybe I don't know, an absent father, I used that term before, just, he was nice to me, he was cool, he didn't curse me out, or even like, he sneered at me, and that was so cool because it was so Lou Reed. But yeah, I think we're, New Yorkers we're cool. We don't like bother famous people. Like we were just having a drink before coming over here, and we were like, oh yeah, that's Elvis Costello over by the pasta counter at Italy. It's like, yeah, that hat. But we didn't bother, did we?
I don't think so.
No.
We played it cool.
Yeah, we played it cool. But I think that, we're still, there are things that you like to, that you like to note that makes you feel like, wow, I live in New York, like this is my village. And I think that part of it was, Lou Reed was that in a way that politicians aren't, in a way that, it's partly why I named the book The King of New York. Also, it was like a great David Bowie quote about him, so.
Okay, just a couple more questions from me before we turn it over to you guys. Reed's later work, I think, is complicated, contentious. That's probably true of all of his work, actually. But toward the latter half of his life, he was making records that were kind of uniquely strange. I'm a little bit of a Metallica head, so I wanted to talk to you about Lulu.
A little bit?
Okay, a lot. I wanted to talk to you about Lulu, the record they made together. It was Reed's last official release, right?
Yeah.
So in particular, I wanted to ask you about the closing track, which is called Junior Dad, which you describe correctly in the book as a Freudian minefield of parental failure and childhood fears delivered with a tenderness that had scant precedent in Reed's work. And a few days ago, you sent me a clip of a live performance of the song on a German television show, and I have to say, I found it devastatingly beautiful. What do you hear on that record and in that song?
Man, that record.
Yeah. Yes.
That record, which did it get like a 1 from Pitchfork?
A 1 or a 0? I can't even.
It was one of the most famously like scathing reviews in Pitchfork. It's a record that in a lot of ways it's a hard record to love. Or maybe even to like sit through, but in the context of the arc of Reed's career, it makes so much sense. It was based on Frederick Wedekind's Lulu plays, and so there is story back there. And in fact, there was a Berg, I think an unfinished Alban Berg opera. Lulu and Lou had done multiple collaborations with Robert Wilson, the great musical theater director with music sometimes, and that was the third work that they did together was Lulu. And it was hard to get exactly a beat. I talked to Robert Wilson, but it was hard to get a beat on what happened with Lulu, but suffice to say that after the first 2 Wilson productions were done in New York, Lulu did not come to New York. It was only done in Europe and I think maybe even Brazil, and he was supposed to do an album of greatest hits with Metallica, because they'd done a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame like anniversary show together, and that was the idea. And it was like
Also a weird idea.
it's a completely weird idea, but like a little bit less weird.
A little bit less weird.
But then literally at the last minute, he just like said, I want to do, like, I wrote all this material for Lulu, for these Lulu plays. I want to use that and make an album. So the Metallica guys were like, well, okay, we're already in, but that was my understanding. And they made this album that was a lot of violent imagery, like it's true to the Wedekind Lulu plays. Jack the Ripper is a major figure in it, so there's like a lot of blood. There's a lot of sex. There's just a lot of like nasty violence, and distilling that into like a loud album of music is it's a tough listen. But Junior Dad is this beautiful closer, 18 minutes long. Supposedly, at least a couple of the guys in the band were literally in tears because of the issues that it brought up involving their relationships with their dads, because it's about fathers and yearning for a father's love and attention. And the song is one that Laurie Anderson also performs and has performed since Lou passed. So it's a song that I feel like is kind of like a continuation. It's almost an afterlife song.
Yes, absolutely. And well, speaking of tears, in the book you quote an Onion headline that ran shortly after Reed received a liver transplant at the Cleveland Clinic, which was "New liver complains of difficulty working with Lou Reed." Which is just one of the all-time greats.
Whoever wrote that, kudos. And the whole article, it's like every line is...
It's so good, incredibly funny. But the passages describe, this was of course before he actually went into liver failure, the passages describing his death were, as I mentioned before, I thought just tremendously beautiful. I wept while reading them in a very sort of deep and cleansing way. And this is a very personal question, but did it make you cry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is embarrassing to say, like, it made me cry when I was talking to a person, Kevin Hearn, a beautiful man, great musician, who I'd actually met years and years earlier, writing a story on a Canadian band that he was in for Rolling Stone. But he had become Reed's band leader near the end of his life, and spent a lot of Reed's final days with him. So yeah, I teared up hearing him talk about it, and I literally teared up typing it. I remember where I was when I typed the end section of the book. I was actually at Yaddo up in Saratoga Springs, an artists' colony that it really deserves people's support, because I would not have been able to finish this book probably. It would take me another 20 years.
A great place to cry.
A great place to cry in the middle of the woods. But it, I just want to digress super quickly on this, which obviously I don't do quick that well. But writing a biography, and you get a little of this in writing profiles, you get to know people over time, over years sometimes, and people trust you with their stories, or they don't. They're just like, no, I'm not going to talk to you. And you really feel like, it's such an honor, and it's like, I don't want to say it's a weight, but it's a responsibility, I feel, like ethically, and just as a human being, to like just honor the people who are sharing their stories, and to try to, just present them in a way that not only tells a story, like, Janet Malcolm talks about, writing profiles as being like an act of betrayal because you're holding the work and the storytelling paramount. And I get that, but like, I just felt that responsibility of honoring all the people who shared stuff with me that was, in some cases, very personal. This, including this first and foremost, maybe not first, but it's an important part of the book. Would not have happened without him.
Final question from me, and you can answer this with a yes or a no. Having spent 10 years writing this definitive, lovely, complex biography, would you ever write another biography again?
I can't answer that yes or no. I'll just have to. I don't know. Writing a bio, it's like it's very emotional. Like you really get in the weeds. I was talking about like the sense that you're getting involved with family. You're literally getting involved with people's family, extended family, friends, and what have you.
And read too, right? I mean, you had a ghost in your house for 10 years in a way.
Yes, and it's a lot. So I'm not sure.
All right, we won't hold you to anything. Questions from the audience? I believe we have a microphone set up on each side.
Well, thanks, both of you. This is a small question. What do you think of Berlin?
I love songs on Berlin. I love the way it was put together as a film by Reed and Schnabel. The album, just as it was released, there were songs on it that I loved, but I didn't think that it lived up to what he'd envisioned for it, and he'd envisioned it as something that he wanted to really like put on like kind of an opera or a stage piece, which is a thread that he really followed through his entire life, and I think we realized some things with Robert Wilson. So yeah, there are a lot of things I like about it. The DVD of it is essential listening, watching. If you're a Lou Reed fan, it was beautiful when it was redone late in his life. So it's kind of an equivocating answer. But it's hard to like have a simple like, as somebody who's a critic and sometimes has to make snap judgments about records, when you spend a lot of time with a person's oeuvre and see how it fits into the whole picture. I value things about it that might not actually be there in the grooves.
My name is Rao. I'm not born here, so I'm not very familiar with all the cultural nuances, but I'm going to ask you a general question. You have so much material to go through, and congratulations, you spent 10 years. Do you have a theme, like Dorothy going to the yellow brick road, find the wizard? Do you have a particular theme in writing this, picking certain materials? Because you can't put everything from what you have read and explored. Is there a main theme in your book that tied you to all the way? And secondly, was he searching for something in his life? And did he accomplish that at the end of it?
Wow. Well, I mean, there were certainly, I felt there were a lot of themes. Like, I kind of came into this naively thinking like, oh, I'm going to write a book about this musician who's really interesting and whose music I really like. But, it became about a whole lot of things, about family, about identity, about a lot of stuff, about New York City, about arts communities. So those themes kept multiplying like bunnies. And the second question was, was he successful in what he set out to accomplish? One of the last things he said to a friend, I think it was to Julian Schnabel, was, I think he might have said this to a number of people, was, I don't want to be erased. Because people said that he really felt that his work, by and large, people didn't really get it. That it, and he just didn't want to be erased, which I just found so touching. And it's just like, he was not erased. He is not erased. He left behind a body of work that I think people are going to be listening to and getting a lot out of for a very, very, very long time.
It's such a beautiful moment in the book when you quote Julian Schnabel saying that. Iggy Pop said something similar to me too. It was that feeling that I think it's easy now because these records are canon, right? I mean, they're widely considered massively significant, influential albums, but at the time they were ripped apart, and they were not received well, and they didn't sell well, and there was the sense that they were creative failures. And I think for artists like this who are wildly ambitious and do care, it was hurtful. Yeah.
And if you like somebody's work, if you admire somebody's work, if you see their work like is of such great consequence, and they're beating themselves up, I mean, it goes back to what Laurie Anderson said about like, oh, somebody like Lou Reed can make crappy stuff, and isn't that amazing? But it makes me think that when I'm beating myself up about something that like I didn't do right, or I should have written this, or what have you, it's just like, yeah, that's just a natural part of creating anything, If you're not dealing with self-doubt, you're probably doing it wrong. I don't know.
I think that's fair. I think we can maybe squeeze in 2 more questions.
Hey, question about Lou and his the 90s for him. He seemed to have gotten a second wind. Is it in relation to his alcohol, giving up alcohol? Did he ever comment on that? And any part about how his relationship with drugs and alcohol affected his second phase or his resurgence of the 90s?
Well, he didn't get clean. I mean, he got clean in the 80s, clean-ish, in the 80s. And in the 90s, there were a lot of things happening in the 90s. I mean, he reconnected with John Cale, and he ended his first marriage and met Laurie Anderson, and there was a creative blossoming, I think, that coincided with his relationship with her, and it saw him going into all these different creative avenues, the Robert Wilson collaborations, the Hal Wilner projects, and photography he pursued, some pretty interesting photography work. So he was a guy who, he was a great artist, but he did his best work, I think, working with other people. And so when he was able to connect and not kind of lock horns with other people, he created really strong work. Like I think Songs for Drella was really strong, and the New York album, that wasn't 90s, but it was late 80s. That was his collaboration with the guitarist Mike Rathke and Fernando Saunders. That was, really magnificent. And, I think the works that he did with Robert Wilson were really underappreciated. Some of his greatest latter-day songwriting came out of those. So, he had a lot of stages.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, one more question.
Thank you very much. It's safe to say that the lyrics in The Velvet Underground and Lou Reed, Oeuvre, are quite cryptic across the board, but there are a handful of songs that are particularly notoriously inscrutable. You could point to the Black Angel's Death Song and Murder Mystery in particular. And I believe that Lou Reed at least said for sure that the lyrics to Black Angel's Death Song were just them playing around with words. It was not meant to be read more deeply. So on one hand, you could see that as an extension of their sonic experimentation. But on the other hand, he can really be full of beans at times. And those lyrics in those two songs really seem meaningful to me. So I wonder, do you take him at face value for any comments he's made like that? And should that stop someone from seeking deeper meaning anyway?
I don't know, you want to take that one, Amanda?
No, I would not take his dismissiveness at face value. I think he was dismissive of Metal Machine music, too. I think he used to circulate that rumor that was like, I just wanted to get out of my record contract. I don't think that was true at all. In fact, I think later on, he said that was not true. No, I wouldn't take it at face value, but who cares what I think? What do you think?
Well, I care what you think. I think everybody cares what you think. And really, we're both critics, right? So it's like, if you learn anything, is that the artist is not the only arbiter of what a piece of art does. And most artists...
Sometimes they're the worst arbiter.
Sometimes they're the worst, They make stuff. They put it out there. And we feel whatever it triggers. We make meaning from it. Which may or may not have anything to do with what they, intentional fallacy. I know there are some English professors in the room who could probably speak to that. But yeah, I think that, he, partly it was maybe self-doubt, cover your ass, say something is crappy, just in case maybe it is, but if it isn't. But there's also like a little bit of, and I wrote about Lamont Young in the sense too that like these great artistic geniuses, many of which came from New York, had a little bit of like New York bullshit artist, kind of hustle about them, like there's a little wink going on. So, I think maybe that's rolled up in there too,
Certainly, yes. But I think, it's yours now. It's ours now, right? And I think we get to hold it.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everybody for coming.
Thank you guys all so much. Thank you again to Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation. And thank you to Will Hermes. The best there is, the best to do it.
Thank you. And special thanks to the Leon Levy Center who sponsored this. And
Very much so.